Now that we looked at how we classify animals, we're going to look specifically at the kingdom Animalia, since that is where we are going to start, and then look at some terms that we need to know to differentiate one type of animal from another. So we know that there are 7 levels of taxonomic classification: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and then genus and species. If you're looking at the human, and that does not have all of it, but like kingdom is Animalia, phylum is Chordata, class is mammal, order is primates, family is hominid. Genus is going to be, I'm not sure what the order is, but genus is Homo, and then the species is Sapien. So if you're looking at that for a lion, they're Animalia, they're Chordata, they're mammal, but they're carnivore, and Felidae is like the cat family. For an anteater, Animalia, Chordata, mammal, Xenarthra, and family, I'm not even going to try to, Myrmecopagidae. Some of them are not the easiest to say. Okay, so we get that. We're going to zip through some of these other examples that have been listed. So if you look at an animal species, there are somewhere between 9 and 10 million species of animals that inhabit the earth. So they go from the simplest organisms like sponges all the way up to the more complex with mammals. They live in all ranges of habitats and all different environments. About only 800,000 species have been identified. So there are a lot of areas where we've not necessarily found organisms. There's a lot of smaller ones that is based on our technology and our ability to actually discover them. And then some of these areas that have high biodiversity, it's finding those organisms before they die out. Some of those areas are disappearing where we find them. So some things that we see. We know that there are about 36 different phyla within the kingdom Animalia. So if you're looking at animals or Animalia, we mostly think of having animals. The main thing are mammals, but if you look at the groupings, arthropods are 87% of animals. Between insects, crustaceans, spiders, centipedes, and millipedes, they make up 80% of the animal kingdom. The other only make up 12%, and of that 12%, you have 5% are mollusks, only 2% are chordata, 1% is cnidarian, 1% is platyhelminthes. So cnidarians are jellyfish, and a hydra. Platyhelminthes are flatworms, roundworms, and nematodes are 1%. Annelids are like earthworms are 1%, porifera sponges are 1%, and then echinodermata, which are starfish, are 1%. So arthropods are the most dominant, especially insects, the most successful animal in all of the groupings. So here are some terms and characteristics that we use to describe organisms that fall under the kingdom Animalia. Number 1, we're all multicellular. We have more than one cell. As you move from being, or as organisms moved and changed from being single-celled to multicellular organisms, they had to have their cells begin to work together. A single-celled organism can get its own food, it can get rid of its wastes, it doesn't need any other cells. If you start putting cells together in groups or clusters, those cells that are in the center are not going to be able to get their food or to get rid of their wastes. So you start seeing specializations within the organism that allow some cells to get the food, some cells to get rid of the waste, so that all of the cells actually survive together. We call them mitochondrial heterotrophs. Heterotrophs means we have to eat our own food. So anything in the Animalia kingdom has to be able to ingest food. They are mitochondrial heterotrophs because we all undergo cellular respiration. If you remember that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, it allows our bodies to undergo cellular respiration, which means that we burn our sugar with oxygen to get ATP. And ATP is our fuel, kind of like gases for a car. All of your cells, your brain, everything runs on ATP. So anything that's an animal breaks down their sugar with oxygen in the mitochondria to produce ATP for energy. So basically, yeah, they have multiple cells, they have a mitochondria, and they rely on other organisms for their nourishment. They ingest their food, and the other thing is, for the most part, most animals ingest their food and then digest it in internal cavity. Not all animals have a full digestive system. Some have diffusion, the simplest ones. Some have a one opening system, which means that basically it digests it and then it lets the whatever's left out through the same hole. Then we get to those that have a body cavity and have a complete digestive system. But usually there's some type of a chamber or a place where the food gets digested. Okay, so you guys are going to reflect on this and write when we do it as a paired X. Whoops. Sorry, I don't know how that went to the next thing there. Okay, so some things that we see for all animals. Number one is we have haploid gametes. Haploid and diploid, these are terms we went over in biology. Normally, a normal cell for humans has 46 chromosomes. You have 23 pairs. One of those came from your mother, one of those came from your father. So we have 2 copies of 23 chromosomes. Each of those 23 chromosomes that you have a pair of have genes for certain traits. When we pass our genes on to our children, I can't give my children 46 chromosomes, because if my husband gives them 46, then they'll have 92, which means they will not survive. So when we produce gametes or go to produce our offspring, we half the number of chromosomes that we give our offspring, because our partner will give them the other half. So haploid gamete means, diploid means 2, so we're diploid, we have 2 copies of each chromosome. Haploid means 1, so when we produce egg or sperm, instead of having 2 copies of chromosomes, we give 1 copy of our chromosomes to our offspring, because the other parent is going to give the second chromosome, so that they have, so they become diploid. They are multicellular. We know that they lack cell walls because that's characteristic of plants. We have cell membranes, but we do not have cell walls. They have mitochondria for energy. They are heterotrophic, which means they ingest their food, and we undergo aerobic respiration. And aerobic respiration means that we basically use oxygen to burn our food to get energy. So we have to have oxygen to burn our food to produce ATP. Some organisms are anaerobic, not animals, but anaerobic organisms do not require oxygen in order to produce energy. Okay, so animals that are haploid and produce haploid gametes. Haploid means half the number of chromosomes. So basically we have two processes in which we reproduce cells. Mitosis, we take one cell and we make an exact copy of it. So if you're growing, if you're healing, that's mitosis. Meiosis is different. Meiosis is the division or cell division whereby we take a cell that's diploid and then we divide it so it has half the number of chromosomes or is haploid. Meiosis only occurs when you're producing gametes or sex cells. So animals or adult animals produce haploid cells that have half the number of chromosomes. They go through a division called meiosis. There are 2 parts to meiosis division that actually allows those cells to get down to half the number of chromosomes. In the case of humans, egg and sperm contain 23 chromosomes each. So when we do that in class, you'll go through and write on that. Mitochondrial eukaryotes. Our cells contain mitochondria. Inside of that mitochondria undergoes the process of cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is oxygen combines with glucose to produce water, carbon dioxide, and ATP. When glucose is completely broken down, we produce 36 ATP. When it's not completely broken down, then we do not produce the full amount. But to get the most out of our energy, we go through that whole process. Okay, so in order for us to acquire glucose, which is necessary for energy. We need to be consumers, and we consume things or other organisms that already have glucose. In order to acquire the oxygen, we must have a mechanism to obtain it. So we must have some type of a respiratory system. So in simple organisms that are not more than a couple cell layers thick, it's diffusion. Even some more advanced animals, we talked at the beginning of class, or we talked at class the other day about frogs, and the fact that frogs are now an indicator species because they are quickly dying off, and part of the reason they're dying off is a fungus that is on their skin, and they thicken their skin to get rid of the fungus, but part of the respiratory system is their skin, and that's why frogs are moist and toads are not. Frogs absorb some of the oxygen that they take in through the skin. So most animals have some means of respiration. It can be gills, it can be diffusion, or it can be a lung. Animals also have the ability to move. Not all, but even if the animal is not mobile, some point in its life cycle it moves. So most animals are capable of complex and relatively rapid movement compared to plants and other organisms. So for example, a sponge doesn't move, but a sponge, when it reproduces, produces a larva that actually swims, so that all of the offspring are not living in the same area that the parent is and not competing with them. Okay, so animal reproduction. Most animals reproduce sexually by means of these haploid cells, egg and sperm. Some do have forms of asexual reproduction, especially if they are not very mobile or do not encounter a mate very often. Then they can sometimes, like sponges, reproduce by budding. They can form another sponge that comes off. Some animals do have the ability to regenerate. So like if you lizards losing their tail, starfish and planaria, if you cut them, they'll grow back the other parts. Most animals are diploid, which means the cells of the adults contain 2 copies of the genetic material. And animals vary in size, so no more than a few cells to organisms that weigh many tons like a whale. Animal habitats. Most animals inhabit the seas, with fewer in fresh water and even fewer on land. So most animals are living in some form of water. If you're looking at animal cells, they are eukaryotic. They have internal structures we call organelles, and each organelle has a specific function for the cell. They are kind of like mini organs that help the cell to run and function. They do not have cell walls like you see in plants. Here's a familiar diagram of the parts of the cell. You do not need those for this unit. We are going to start talking about symmetry. So symmetry, movement, encephalization, and segmentation. Symmetry is basically how you divide an organism and whether or not you can divide it into equal parts. We're going to look at the different types of symmetry. There's asymmetrical, there's radial symmetry, and then there's bilateral symmetry. We're also going to go into the concept of cephalization, which is formation of a head and having sense organs. And I will continue that because I'm about to run out of time on this video, and I will finish up the rest of the notes for next week on this and post them.